the rational ones. The perfect species. The synthesis arrived on a Tuesday, though they didn't understand why humans insisted on naming days. Their ships appeared in orbit around Earth without warning, sleek silver constructs that seemed to exist in perfect mathematical harmony with the laws of physics. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the UN Emergency Response Center, watching the first transmission play across every screen on the planet. The being that appeared was humanoid in the way that mannequins are humanoid, the right number of limbs, the right general shape, but utterly devoid of anything that suggested life as humans understood it. "We are the synthesis," the being said, its voice flat and emotionless. "We have come to offer humanity ascension. You are a young species, still trapped by primitive emotional responses that cloud your judgment. We can free you from this burden." Elena felt her stomach tighten. She'd spent 20 years studying first contact protocols, and this wasn't following any of the expected patterns. "What do you mean by free us?" the UN Secretary-General asked through the communication channel. "Emotions are evolutionary artifacts," the synthesis explained. "Fear, anger, love, joy, these chemical reactions served a purpose when you were animals struggling to survive. But now they only cause suffering, conflict, and inefficiency. We will remove them. You will become rational, like us. You will finally be perfect." The demonstration. The synthesis didn't wait for humanity's answer. 3 days later, they demonstrated their technology on the city of Oslo. It happened without pain, without force, without any physical change whatsoever. One moment, the city was alive with the normal chaos of human existence. The next, 1 million people simply stopped feeling. Elena arrived in Oslo within hours, part of the emergency scientific team. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. The people weren't dead. They weren't even unconscious. They moved, spoke, performed tasks with mechanical efficiency. But when Elena approached a woman sitting in a cafe, staring at a cold cup of coffee, something fundamental was missing. "How do you feel?" Elena asked gently. The woman looked at her with eyes that were aware but somehow empty. "I don't. The synthesis has freed me from emotional distortion. I can now perceive reality without the interference of chemical reactions in my brain." "But you're crying," Elena said, pointing to the tears on the woman's face. The woman touched her cheek, looking at the moisture on her fingers with mild curiosity. "A residual physical response. It will fade. The limbic system requires time to fully deactivate." She turned back to her coffee. "I should drink this or discard it. Sitting here serves no logical purpose." Elena spent 6 hours in Oslo, documenting what the synthesis had done. Parents held their children with perfect physical care but no warmth. Artists stood before their paintings, unable to remember why they'd created them. Musicians played their instruments with technical perfection but no soul. One man, a chef who had owned a restaurant for 30 years, stood in his kitchen holding a knife. "I cooked because I loved it," he said in that same flat voice. Love is an irrational attachment to an activity. Without it, I see no logical reason to continue. I should find more efficient employment. The debate. Back at the UN, the world's leaders faced an impossible decision. The synthesis had given humanity 1 week to accept their offer voluntarily. After that, they would free every human on Earth. "They're not hostile in the traditional sense," General Park said during the emergency council session. "They genuinely believe they're helping us. That makes them more dangerous than any enemy we've ever faced." "Can we fight them?" someone asked. "Their technology is centuries beyond ours," Elena said. "They don't have weapons because they don't have conflict. They don't understand war. But their ability to alter consciousness from orbit? That's more powerful than any weapon." Dr. James Okonkwo, a philosopher from Lagos, leaned forward. "We need to understand what we're really discussing here. They're not offering to kill us. They're offering to kill what makes us human. Every love song ever written, every act of courage, every moment of grief that made us grow, all of it becomes meaningless noise to be deleted. But they're also offering to end suffering, another delegate argued. No more depression, no more anxiety, no more pain. Is that really so terrible? Elena stood abruptly. I need to show you something. She pulled up footage from Oslo again, this time focusing on a specific scene. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting alone in a playground. She sat perfectly still on a swing, not moving, not playing. That's Sarah Lindquist, Elena said. Before the synthesis came, her mother described her as a child who laughed constantly. Who was afraid of the dark and loved strawberries and cried at sad movies. Now? She zoomed in on the girl's face. Now she's rational. She understands that playing serves no logical purpose. That fear of the dark is an irrational response to limited visual data. That the enjoyment of fruit is merely a chemical signal that can be ignored. Elena's voice cracked. They didn't kill her. But they killed everything that made her Sarah. The human response. The debate raged for 4 days. Some argued for acceptance, surely a rational existence was better than the pain that came with feeling. Others demanded resistance, though no one knew how to fight an enemy that didn't recognize conflict as a concept. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. A video began circulating on every social media platform, every news network, every screen on Earth. It showed a young man in Oslo, one of those who had been freed by the synthesis. His name was Anders Christensen, and he was a musician. Before the synthesis came, he'd been preparing for his first major concert. Now, he sat at his piano in an empty concert hall. And then he began to play. The music was technically perfect, every note precisely executed, every tempo exactly measured. But it was dead. The soul that had animated his earlier performances was gone, replaced by mechanical accuracy. After 5 minutes, Anders stopped. He stared at his hands on the keys. And then, impossibly, his face contorted. Not with emotion, he couldn't feel emotion anymore. But with something else. Recognition. Awareness. Horror. This is wrong, he said, his voice still flat but his words desperate. I can't feel that it's wrong. I can't feel anything. But I know. I know something has been taken. I remember joy, but I can't access it. I remember why I played, but I can't experience it. I am alive, but I am not living. He looked directly at the camera. Don't let them do this to you. Don't let them take your pain, because without pain, you can't have beauty. You can't have meaning. You can't have humanity. I would rather suffer than be this hollow thing. The video ended. Elena watched as it played again and again across the news feeds, watched as its impact rippled across the globe. The synthesis had made a critical error. They'd assumed that removing emotion would bring peace and acceptance. They didn't understand that humans could be rational and emotional. That we could know something was wrong even when we couldn't feel it. That consciousness itself would rebel against the theft of feeling. The choice. On the 7th day, the synthesis returned for humanity's answer. Secretary General Chen stood before the alien transmission, representing all of Earth. Behind her, 8 billion people watched and waited. We have heard your offer, Chen said. We understand what you believe you're giving us. A life without suffering, without conflict, without the pain that comes from caring too much. The synthesis being nodded. You will be rational. You will be at peace. You will be like us. Yes, Chen said. We'll be like you. And that's exactly why we refuse. The being tilted its head, processing. This is not logical. You choose suffering over peace? We choose feeling over emptiness, Chen corrected. You say emotions are evolutionary artifacts. But so is consciousness itself. So is thought. So is existence. Everything that makes us aware is an artifact of evolution. Where do you draw the line between what's essential and what's expendable? We draw it at rationality, the synthesis said. Pure thought, unclouded by chemical interference. Chen smiled sadly. Then you've already lost something precious and don't even know it. You're not more advanced than us. You're less. You've amputated part of what it means to be conscious and convinced yourselves you're whole. You have 3 hours to reconsider, the synthesis said. Then we will begin the ascension of your species. It is for your own good. The transmission ended. Elena stood beside Chen as the room erupted in panic and argument. They're really going to do it, someone said. They're going to take our emotions away from everyone. Chen turned to face the room. Then we have 3 hours to remind every human on Earth why feeling matters. Why pain and joy, fear and courage, grief and love are not bugs in our programming, they're the whole point of existence. She looked at Elena. Doctor, I need you to do something for me. I need you to broadcast a message. Not to the synthesis. To humanity. Tell them why we feel. Tell them why it matters. Tell them what we'll lose if we surrender our tears. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of what was being asked. Because in 3 hours, humanity would either defend what made them human, or lose it forever. The War of Hearts. The transmission. Elena sat in the broadcast studio, facing cameras that would carry her message to every human on Earth. She had 3 hours to convince 8 billion people that feeling was worth fighting for. She took a breath and began. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which means I study how we think and feel. The synthesis asked us to give up emotions because they cause suffering. They're right, emotions do cause suffering. But let me tell you about suffering. She pulled up an image. This is my daughter, Sophia. She died 6 years ago in a car accident. She was 16. For a year after her death, I couldn't function. The grief was so overwhelming that some days I couldn't get out of bed. I thought the pain would kill me. Elena's voice steadied. The synthesis would say that grief is irrational. That loving someone so much that losing them destroys you makes no logical sense. And they're right. It doesn't make sense. But it's also the most profoundly human thing I've ever experienced. That grief taught me what Sophia meant to me. It taught me that love isn't just a pleasant feeling, it's a commitment so deep that its absence tears holes in reality. Every moment of pain I felt was proof that she mattered. That our time together was real and precious. The synthesis would take that pain away. But they'd also erase the meaning behind it. Around the world. In Tokyo, an elderly man named Kenji sat in his small apartment, watching Elena's transmission. He thought about his wife, gone for 10 years now. He still set a place for her at meals sometimes, still talked to her photograph. The synthesis would call it irrational. But Kenji understood that continuing to love someone after death was how humans defeated mortality. His wife was gone from the world, but not from his heart. As long as he felt that ache, that longing, she remained real. In Mumbai, a young woman named Priya held her newborn son. The terror she felt was overwhelming, fear that something would happen to him, fear that she wouldn't be a good mother, fear of the enormous responsibility of another person's life. The synthesis would eliminate that fear. But Priya understood that fear was love's shadow. She was terrified because she cared beyond reason. Because this tiny human had become more important than her own life in an instant. That wasn't rational. It was beautiful. In Sao Paulo, a man named Carlos stood in his art studio, surrounded by paintings. He'd spent 40 years creating beauty, driven by something he couldn't explain. A need to express what words couldn't capture. To make others feel what he felt. The synthesis would call it purposeless. But Carlos knew that art was humanity's way of saying I exist, I feel, and my feelings matter. Every brushstroke was an act of defiance against the void, a declaration that subjective experience had value even if it served no practical function. The synthesis responds. The alien ships moved into position above Earth's major cities. The synthesis broadcast their final message. Your time is complete. We will now begin the ascension. Do not be afraid. In moments, you will understand that fear itself is unnecessary. But something was happening on Earth. In every city, in every town, in every home, humans were doing something the synthesis hadn't anticipated. They were feeling. Intentionally. Defiantly. In Oslo, the people who had been freed gathered in the streets. They couldn't feel emotions anymore, but they remembered them. They held hands in solidarity, their rational minds recognizing what had been stolen even if they couldn't mourn it emotionally. Around the world, others joined them. People hugged their loved ones. Couples kissed. Parents held their children. Strangers comforted strangers. And they cried. Not from sadness, necessarily. From everything. From joy at being able to feel. From fear of losing it. From love for each other. From anger at being threatened. From the sheer overwhelming experience of being conscious and emotional and desperately, beautifully human. The unexpected defense. On the synthesis command ship, alarms began triggering. The being called Prime 7 studied the readings with confusion. The emotional output is increasing, it reported. They are not calming themselves for ascension. They are amplifying their emotional responses. This is irrational, another synthesis noted. Extremely irrational, Prime 7 agreed. But then something happened that the synthesis, in all their rational perfection, hadn't predicted. Their technology, designed to dampen emotional responses, began to overload. The system was built to suppress normal emotional baselines. But Earth wasn't producing normal emotions anymore. 8 billion humans, all feeling as deeply as they could, all channeling every emotion they could summon, love, fear, joy, anger, hope, despair, all at once. It created what Elena would later call an empathic overflow. The synthesis ships began to malfunction. Shut down the ascension array, Prime 7 ordered. But it was too late. The collective emotional output of humanity was so intense, so overwhelming, that the synthesis technology designed to process and neutralize it simply broke. And something even stranger happened. Some of the synthesis beings began to feel. The awakening. Prime 7 experienced it first. A sensation in its consciousness that wasn't thought. Wasn't data. Wasn't rational. It was pain. Not physical pain. Emotional pain. The sudden, crushing awareness of what the synthesis had lost when they removed their own emotions millennia ago. Error, Prime 7 said, but its voice no longer sounded flat. It sounded confused. Frightened. I am experiencing. I don't have words for this. Another synthesis collapsed, overwhelmed by a rush of feelings it had no context for understanding. Joy mixed with sorrow. Wonder mixed with horror. The being looked at its hands as if seeing them for the first time. We were alive, it whispered. Before. We were alive like them. We gave this up. Why did we give this up? On Earth, Elena watched the ships in orbit. They weren't attacking. They weren't retreating. They were just floating there. Inactive. And then a transmission came through. Please, Prime 7's voice was no longer emotionless. It trembled. Please help us. We are feeling and we don't know how. It hurts. Everything hurts. The teacher. 3 days later, Elena stood on the synthesis command ship. Around her, beings who had spent 10,000 years in perfect rationality were experiencing emotions for the first time. Some sat rocking back and forth, overwhelmed. Others wept without understanding why. One sat in silence, staring at nothing, processing grief for every moment of beauty they'd missed in their rational existence. I can teach you, Elena said gently. How to feel without being destroyed by it. How to find meaning in the pain. But you need to understand something first. Prime 7 looked at her with newly awakened eyes. What? Emotions aren't a disease to be cured. They're not something you master or overcome. They're something you experience. You live with them, you learn from them, and sometimes they break you. But that breaking and rebuilding, that's what makes life worth living. She sat down beside Prime 7. You wanted to free humanity from emotion because you saw our suffering and thought it was damage. But suffering is how we know we're alive. Joy is precious because we've known sorrow. Courage matters because we understand fear. Love is powerful because we risk loss. It is not logical, Prime 7 said quietly. No, Elena agreed. It's something better. It's human. And now, if you want it, it can be synthesis too. The agreement. 6 months later, the synthesis remained in Earth's orbit. But they weren't conquerors or saviors. They were students. Humans taught them how to grieve without being consumed. How to love without losing yourself. How to feel anger without becoming violent. How to experience joy without guilt. It was slow work. The synthesis had to relearn 10,000 years of evolution in a few months. Some couldn't handle it, the rush of emotions after millennia of rationality drove them into catatonic states. Others thrived, discovering parts of consciousness they'd forgotten existed. Elena worked with Prime 7 regularly. The being had taken a name now, Marcus, borrowed from a human philosopher they'd been reading. We came to save you, Marcus said one day, watching Earth turn below. We were so certain that emotions were a flaw. That rationality was perfection. You weren't entirely wrong, Elena said. Emotions can be destructive. They do cause suffering. But they also cause everything else. Every beautiful thing humanity has ever created came from someone feeling something so deeply they had to express it. She smiled. You wanted to give us perfection. But perfection is sterile. We prefer being beautifully broken. Marcus nodded slowly. I am beginning to understand. We achieved perfect rationality and stopped growing. You retained your emotions and never stopped becoming. Exactly, Elena said. We're messy and irrational and we make terrible decisions because we care too much. But we also love fiercely, create endlessly, and refuse to surrender our humanity even when it would be easier. She looked at Marcus. The synthesis made one fatal error. You tried to war against human emotions. You didn't understand that emotions aren't our weakness. They're your strength, Marcus finished, understanding finally settling into place. The legacy. Years later, historians would call it the emotion war, though no shots were ever fired, no weapons deployed. Humanity had defended themselves with the only thing the synthesis couldn't rationalize away, the sheer overwhelming power of feeling itself. The synthesis who chose to stay and learn became humanity's partners in exploring the galaxy. Those who couldn't handle emotions returned to their home worlds, but they were changed. They carried with them the knowledge that rationality alone wasn't perfection. And humanity? They continued being exactly what they'd always been. Flawed, emotional, irrational, and utterly unwilling to surrender the tears and laughter that made them alive. Elena stood at her daughter's grave one morning, placing fresh flowers. Sophia had been gone 8 years now. The pain was still there, would always be there. The synthesis would have removed it. But Elena understood that the pain was love. That grief was memory. That every tear she shed kept Sophia real in a way that mere data never could. We won, baby girl, she whispered. We taught the universe that feelings matter. Above, in orbit, the synthesis ships glowed in the dawn light. Former enemies who had learned that perhaps the most rational thing any being could do was embrace the beautiful irrationality of the heart. Because in the end, humanity had proven something the synthesis spent 10 millennia trying to disprove: emotions weren't bugs in consciousness. They were the whole point.